A medieval king literally drowned in a massive floorboard collapse directly above a giant latrine. Today, we are exploring the 33 most absolutely absurd facts about the Holy Roman Empire. This massive empire produced incredibly unhinged rulers who completely terrified their own innocent peasant populations. We will completely examine a bizarre criminal trial where an official legally prosecuted actual rats. Make absolutely sure you stay for fact number 33 because it involves disguised armed nuns. The Cadaver Synod, propping up a dead pope for trial. Pope Formosus experienced the absolute worst legal trial in all of European history. He was dragged into a Roman courtroom during the bizarre events of 897. The major problem with this specific trial was that the defendant was already completely dead. Pope Stephen VI ordered his predecessor dug up and dressed in golden papal robes. A terrified young deacon stood hiding behind the dead body to answer for the deceased. The screaming judge eventually found the silent corpse guilty of all the completely fabricated charges. This macabre spectacle ended up causing a massive public riot that destroyed the sitting pope. 2. The Defenestration of Prague, surviving a 70-foot drop via manure. Catholic officials experienced a terrible sudden flight out of a high castle window in Prague. In 1618, Protestant rebels marched right into the royal council room demanding immediate answers. The angry mob grabbed 2 imperial regents and simply tossed them out the large window. Falling 70 feet usually guarantees a fast and incredibly painful death on the stone ground. However, these extremely lucky politicians managed to survive the massive drop without any broken bones. Catholic propaganda claimed that divine angels swooped down to catch the falling men in mid-air. Protestant historians argued they actually landed perfectly in a giant steaming pile of horse manure. This ridiculous and messy event immediately sparked the absolutely devastating conflict called the 30 Years' War. Throwing people from windows somehow became a recognized political tradition in this very specific city. 3. The War of the Oaken Bucket. 2 Italian cities fought a very bloody battle over a completely ordinary wooden water bucket. In 1322, soldiers from Modena sneaked right into the rival city of Bologna. They stole a simple wooden bucket from the main city well just to cause trouble. Bologna demanded their stolen property back, but the thieves absolutely refused to return the item. An army of 30,000 angry men marched across the countryside to retrieve their bucket. The massive battle left roughly 2,000 soldiers dead on the muddy medieval combat field. Modena won the terrible fight and happily kept the wooden bucket as a grand trophy. You can still see this ancient stolen bucket hanging in a tower in Modena today. Thousands of people died violently because of a medieval prank involving a cheap wooden pail. 4. The Erfurt latrine disaster, nobles drowning in the floorboards. Dozens of elite German nobles suffered the most humiliating historical death imaginable in 1184. King Henry VI called a major political meeting at a church building in Erfurt. The heavy wooden floor simply collapsed under the combined weight of so many armored men. At least 60 highly respected lords and knights tragically drowned in the absolute worst. The king only survived because he was sitting in a stone alcove with solid floors. He had to be carefully rescued using long ladders pulled through a high stone window. This remains one of the most disgusting and unfortunate architectural failures in early European history. 5. The Dancing Plague of 1518, Grooving to the Grave. A woman stepped into the street and started dancing without any music in 1518. Frau Trophia danced wildly in the French city of Strasbourg for nearly an entire week. Dozens of other citizens randomly joined her in this completely uncontrollable and bizarre public marathon. Local doctors bizarrely believed that more dancing was the only cure for this strange illness. The city council actually hired musicians and built a wooden stage to keep them moving. This terrible medical strategy caused people to literally dance until their hearts completely gave out. Modern scientists still argue about whether this was mass hysteria or toxic mold poisoning bread. A medieval city essentially forced its own citizens to literally boogie themselves into early graves. 6. The Pope who was a teenage gangster. Pope John XII turned the Holy Vatican into a literal crime syndicate around 950. He became the supreme pontiff at just 18 years old and immediately started breaking rules. This completely unhinged teenager reportedly gambled away church donations and toasted to ancient pagan demons. The young pope turned the sacred papal palace into an absolutely notorious den of sin. The Holy Roman Emperor Otto I eventually had to march his army into Rome. He completely deposed the criminal pope and installed a much more boring and respectable replacement. According to medieval gossip, John eventually died after getting beaten by an angry, jealous husband. Giving a rebellious teenager absolute spiritual power produced the most disastrous papal reign in history. 7. The emperor who tried to buy the English throne. An incredibly wealthy German prince simply tried to purchase the English crown with cold cash. Richard of Cornwall was the incredibly rich brother of the actual sitting English royal king. In 1257, he spent a massive fortune bribing electors across the Roman Empire. He successfully bought the title of King of the Romans for an absolutely astronomical price. This royal title was the traditional stepping stone to becoming the Holy Roman Emperor himself. He dumped chests of pure silver onto the continent just to wear a heavy gold crown. Unfortunately, he barely spent any time ruling Germany because the local nobles completely ignored him. His expensive continental adventure achieved basically nothing except draining his massive personal bank account completely. You can buy a very fancy medieval title, but you cannot always buy actual respect. 8. The Battle of Karansepes, an army that accidentally attacked itself. The Austrian army successfully defeated itself without ever seeing a single actual enemy combatant anywhere. In 1788, roughly 100,000 soldiers camped near the town of Karansepes. A few thirsty scouts bought barrels of strong schnapps from some traveling merchants on horseback. Drunken arguments quickly broke out over the alcohol, and somebody suddenly fired a random musket. Panicked soldiers woke up in the dark and mistakenly thought the terrible Turkish army arrived. Different regiments speaking different languages started shooting at each other in the chaotic total darkness. The entire massive army eventually fled the empty battlefield in absolute terror and total confusion. Thousands of men died or sustained serious injuries during this incredibly embarrassing friendly fire disaster. The actual Turkish army arrived days later and easily captured the completely abandoned military camp. 9. The Anti-Pope Schism, 3 popes excommunicating each other. Medieval Europe somehow ended up with 3 different popes simultaneously damning each other to hell. This massive religious crisis began in 1378 when cardinals elected 2 rival popes. One Holy Father ruled from Rome while the other set up shop in southern France. The church tried to fix the problem by electing a brand new compromise pope later. Unfortunately, the first 2 popes absolutely refused to step down from their very powerful positions. This left 3 angry men wearing papal tiaras and demanding total obedience from all kings. They spent decades launching spiritual attacks and excommunicating the followers of their 2 bitter rivals. The chaos finally ended at the Council of Constance, when a single legitimate pope emerged. Having 3 separate men claiming absolute divine authority made the entire church look completely ridiculous. 10. The criminal trial of the rats. A highly respected medieval judge seriously summoned a swarm of rats to a public courtroom. In early 16th century France, rats destroyed the vital local barley crop in a village. The church officially charged the rodents with severe criminal damage and ordered a full trial. A brilliant human lawyer named Bartholomew Chassany was appointed to defend the guilty fuzzy criminals. He argued his tiny clients missed their court date because feral cats blocked their paths. The judge found this legal defense totally reasonable and completely delayed the bizarre animal trial. This smart lawyer built his entire successful legal career by passionately defending criminal field pests. European courts regularly put pigs and bugs on trial, but this rat case remains legendary. Holding wild animals to strict human legal standards was a perfectly normal medieval justice procedure. 11. The archbishop who fought in full armor with a mace. A powerful holy archbishop regularly smashed his political enemies using a massive. Christian of Mainz was a powerful church leader during the turbulent 12th century in Europe. He preferred riding into brutal combat rather than preaching peaceful sermons to his quiet congregation. Church law strictly forbade holy men from using swords because they shed actual human blood. He wore shining plate armor over his holy robes and completely terrified the opposing armies. This violent bishop personally led troops into Italy to defend the Holy Roman Emperor fiercely. Some medieval church leaders clearly valued brutal martial arts over standard peaceful religious spiritual practices. 12. The Peasant Republic of Defenestration. A tiny group of farmers successfully defended their independent republic against massive, heavily armored armies. They refused to bow down to any arrogant kings or wealthy dukes for many centuries. In 1500, the Danish king invaded their marshy homeland with a huge mercenary army. The clever peasants simply opened the sea dikes and completely flooded the flat, muddy battlefield. Heavily armored knights drowned in freezing muddy water, while local farmers easily slaughtered the survivors. These incredibly tough farmers captured the royal banner and chased the terrified king away quickly. They maintained their absolute freedom for another 50 years before a larger empire defeated them. Never underestimate angry coastal farmers fighting for their absolute freedom in their own swampy backyards. 13. The emperor who slept wearing his crown. Emperor Otto III had such massive delusions of grandeur he slept wearing heavy jewelry. In the late 10th century, this young ruler desperately wanted to resurrect the Roman Empire. He built a massive palace in Rome and introduced incredibly strict and strange court rituals. Otto famously ate his meals, sitting completely alone at an elevated table like a god. He supposedly refused to take off his heavy imperial crown even while sleeping in bed. The young emperor even dug up the dead body of Charlemagne just to look inside. His bizarre obsession with ancient Rome completely alienated his powerful German nobles and military supporters. The local citizens of Rome eventually rebelled and violently chased the strange teenager out completely. He died mysteriously at age 21 after accomplishing absolutely nothing of any real value. 14. The Bishop Eaten by Mice in a Tower. A cruel bishop allegedly suffered the most horrific rodent-based death in all medieval folklore. During a terrible 10th century famine, Bishop Hatto hoarded vast amounts of grain for himself. Starving peasants begged him for food, so he locked them inside a large, empty barn. He completely burned the building down and cruelly joked that the screaming peasants were mice. According to the dark legend, thousands of actual mice suddenly swarmed the bishop in revenge. He fled to a tall stone tower situated right in the middle of a massive river. The massive army of mice simply swam across the deep water and chewed through doors. While probably just a myth, this story effectively terrified greedy nobles for many long centuries. 15. The Siege, where women carried their husbands to safety. Clever wives literally carried their husbands on their backs to save them from immediate execution. In 1140, Emperor Conrad III completely surrounded the rebel castle of Weinsberg successfully. The furious emperor promised to utterly destroy the rebellious men trapped inside the stone fortress. He generously allowed the local women to leave safely carrying whatever they could physically hold. The emperor fully expected these women to walk out carrying gold jewelry and expensive clothing. Instead, the heavy fortress doors opened, and women marched out carrying their terrified adult husbands. The angry imperial generals demanded immediate executions, but the impressed emperor started laughing out loud. Conrad kept his royal promise and allowed the exhausted women to save their doomed spouses. This absolutely brilliant loophole saved hundreds of lives and created a legendary medieval romance story. 16. The emperor who collected giant soldiers. A powerful Prussian king obsessively kidnapped the tallest men in Europe for his personal army. King Frederick William I ruled over territories closely tied to the Holy Roman Empire. He formed a special military regiment known exclusively as the Potsdam Giants in the 1700s. Every single soldier in this unit had to be at least 6 feet tall minimum. The king paid absolute fortunes to foreign rulers in exchange for their tallest peasant farmers. If a giant man refused to join the army, the king simply had him kidnapped. He reportedly forced incredibly tall men and tall women to marry and produce giant babies. Despite all this military obsession, the giant regiment basically never fought in any real battles. They were essentially just an incredibly expensive living toy collection for a deeply weird monarch. 17. The imperial diet that was literally just a drinking contest. Important diplomatic meetings in the empire often devolved into absolute chaotic, medieval, drunken fraternity parties. Princes and nobles gathered regularly at imperial diets to discuss extremely serious religious and political laws. During the 16th century, these vital political summits involved absolutely staggering amounts of alcohol consumption. German princes brought their own massive beer barrels to prove their wealth and incredible tolerance. Political negotiation simply halted because most of the ruling council was completely passed out drunk. Emperor Charles V was absolutely disgusted by the endless loud belching and vomiting nobles. One minor noble supposedly drank himself to death trying to impress a visiting foreign ambassador. The most advanced political body in Europe functioned mostly as an excuse for binge drinking. Trying to run an empire is extremely difficult when the entire government is completely hammered. 18. The town that officially sued an insect. A small town legally prosecuted destructive bugs to protect their very precious local vineyard grapes. In the 16th century, the French town of Saint-Julien noticed weevils destroying their crops. Instead of using standard poison, they hired an expensive lawyer to sue the actual insects. The legal battle lasted for several months while the bugs completely ignored the official court. The town offered to build a special insect reserve where the weevils could live peacefully. Lawyers passionately argued that insects had a divine right to eat plants created by God. The final official verdict of this completely ridiculous medieval legal trial remains lost to history. However, it perfectly highlights how medieval people believed the entire natural world followed human laws. Spending civic money to legally debate a tiny green bug is absolute peak historical bureaucracy. 19. Gerd von Berlichingen, the knight with the iron prosthetic hand. A legendary medieval knight lost his hand in battle and replaced it with heavy iron. Gerd von Berlichingen was a famous 16th century mercenary fighting across the Holy Roman Empire. A cannonball shattered his right arm during a siege, leaving him severely disabled and bleeding. He commissioned a blacksmith to forge a complex iron hand with fully movable metal fingers. This mechanical marvel allowed him to comfortably hold a heavy sword and firmly grip reins. Goetz continued his violent mercenary career for another 40 years, wearing this terrifying metal prosthetic. He famously coined a very vulgar insult when a bishop ordered him to surrender peacefully. He yelled at the enemy forces to physically kiss his absolute backside from a high window. This metal-armed warrior lived to be 80 years old despite fighting in endless wars. 20. The Pope who sold the papacy to get married. One incredibly corrupt pope actually sold his holy title for cold cash to get married. Pope Benedict IX achieved absolute power in Rome around 1032 extremely young. He was widely considered one of the absolute worst and most scandalous popes in history. After years of chaotic ruling, he suddenly decided he wanted to marry a local woman. Benedict offered to resign the supreme papacy if someone paid him a massive financial fortune. His own godfather completely paid off the massive bribe and took over the Holy Throne. Benedict later changed his mind and tried to violently steal the papal throne back again. He successfully managed to be the official pope 3 completely separate times during his life. Treating the holiest position in Europe like a used carriage perfectly captures medieval church corruption. 21. The emperor who spoke 10 languages but refused to speak to his wife. Emperor Charles V famously mastered multiple languages but practically ignored his own royal spouse. He controlled massive territories stretching from Germany and Spain all the way to South America. Charles supposedly claimed he spoke Spanish to God and spoke German exclusively to his horses. Despite his incredible linguistic skills, he maintained an extremely distant relationship with his Portuguese wife. Isabella of Portugal effectively governed the entire Spanish Empire while Charles traveled fighting endless wars. He rarely wrote her any personal letters during his incredibly long and brutal military campaigns. When she suddenly died, Charles was absolutely devastated and wore black clothing for his life. He finally realized her incredible political value only after she was already completely gone forever. Knowing 10 different languages is completely useless if you never actually talk to your family. 22. The city that revolted over sausage production. Furious citizens launched a massive violent rebellion simply because the government changed their local sausages. In 1520, the city of Königsberg faced a very severe and annoying economic crisis. The local bakers and butchers started producing much smaller loaves of bread and thinner sausages. Hungry citizens felt completely betrayed by these highly offensive reductions to their beloved meat products. Thousands of angry peasants stormed the streets and physically attacked the greedy, wealthy merchant class. They smashed market stalls and demanded the immediate return of their traditional, thick, juicy sausages. The local noble authorities eventually had to call in heavily armed guards to restore order. Several riot leaders were brutally executed just to protect the standard commercial meat market economy. Never underestimate how violently European peasants will react when you mess with their traditional food. 23. The Prince Bishopric, ruled by a 10-year-old. A literal child became the supreme spiritual and political ruler of a massive German territory. In the mid-18th century, powerful noble families entirely controlled the German Catholic Church hierarchy. They frequently appointed their incredibly young children to high-ranking, extremely wealthy, powerful church positions. One specific Prince Bishopric was completely handed over to a 10-year-old noble boy. This small child officially commanded vast wealthy lands and possessed absolute power over peasant farmers. He obviously spent his time playing games while corrupt older advisors completely ran the government. The entire religious population had to legally pretend this child possessed absolute divine spiritual wisdom. This ridiculous practice demonstrated exactly why the common people completely hated the wealthy ruling class. Trusting a toddler with a national economy and holy salvation is a recipe for complete disaster. 24. The law requiring bakers to be dunked in puddles for bad bread. Medieval towns designed incredibly creative and completely humiliating punishments for terrible local bakery business owners. Bread was the absolute most important daily food source for every single medieval European peasant. If a baker secretly mixed cheap sawdust into the flour, citizens faced terrible, deadly starvation. Towns across the empire invented a device called a cucking stool to punish cheating bakers. Corrupt bakers were strapped to a long wooden plank suspended right over a muddy puddle. Huge crowds gathered to mock the wet, freezing criminal and throw rotten food at them. This intense public humiliation guaranteed that bakers always measured their heavy flour sacks completely perfectly. 25. The mercenary armies that went on strike for better loot. Heavily armed German mercenaries literally stopped fighting massive wars until generals promised them richer plunder. The Landsknechte were absolutely terrifying, highly trained soldiers who wore incredibly bright, flashy colored clothing. During the 16th century, they fought the most brutal military campaigns for the highest bidder. These dangerous men possessed zero actual loyalty to any specific king or holy religious ideology. If their royal employer missed a single weekly paycheck, the entire terrifying army simply quit. They famously staged a massive armed strike right in the middle of a major campaign. They demanded absolute permission to completely sack and destroy a wealthy Italian city for money. Generals always caved to their violent demands because these angry men were incredibly effective killers. Running a medieval empire is extremely hard when your entire military functions like angry pirates. 26. The royal banquet interrupted by a wild bear. A massive wild bear completely destroyed an incredibly fancy diplomatic dinner party in the empire. During a major royal feast, a heavily drunk noble thought he could entertain the guests. He deliberately unlocked an iron cage holding a massive captured wild bear inside the castle. The angry bear immediately sprinted straight into the incredibly crowded, loud medieval royal dining hall. Wealthy, terrified nobles completely panicked and frantically climbed onto high wooden tables to escape death. The massive animal started violently smashing expensive plates and eating the roasted meat main courses. Brave, heavily armed guards finally managed to surround and safely capture the terrifying furry intruder. The completely foolish drunk noble faced severe punishment for ruining the absolute best royal party. Inviting a massive angry predator to a fancy political dinner is a universally terrible idea. 27. The Duke who tried to tax facial hair. While Peter the Great famously taxed Russian beards, some German dukes tried similar ridiculous schemes. A minor nobleman in the empire desperately needed extra cash to fund his lavish lifestyle. He passed a very strict new law charging a heavy silver tax on male facial beards. If a man refused to pay up, the town guards simply pinned him down violently. The peasant population absolutely hated this law and frequently rioted against the aggressive royal barbers. The bizarre facial hair tax completely failed to raise any real money for the Duke. 28. The emperor who died from eating too many melons. Emperor Frederick III survived decades of bloody wars but completely lost against fresh fruit. In 1493, the incredibly powerful Holy Roman Emperor was suffering from severe leg infections. Surgeons successfully amputated his infected leg, and the tough old ruler actually started recovering nicely. Unfortunately, Frederick possessed an absolute massive and completely uncontrollable addiction to eating ripe sweet melons. Against the strict advice of his royal doctors, he devoured a massive pile of fresh fruit. His digestive system completely collapsed under the sudden heavy strain of all that raw melon. This powerful man survived terrible, massive political assassinations, but fell victim to a simple cantaloupe. Dietary self-control is incredibly important, especially when you rule over massive parts of Europe. 29. The castle siege won by throwing beehives over the wall. A clever defending army defeated their powerful medieval attackers using highly aggressive flying stinging insects. During a fierce 11th century conflict, an army completely surrounded a very small stone fortress. The desperate defenders ran completely out of heavy rocks and boiling oil to throw down. They cleverly gathered dozens of extremely active, angry beehives from the local surrounding castle gardens. Soldiers hurled the heavy, buzzing wooden hives directly down onto the completely exposed enemy troops. The fragile hives shattered loudly, releasing thousands of absolutely furious, stinging bees into enemy armor. Heavily armored knights completely panicked because they could not swat the tiny bugs away quickly. The entire massive attacking army broke their formation and ran away screaming into the deep forest. Biological warfare has existed for centuries, and angry insects are absolutely terrifying medieval combat weapons. 30. The Count who faked his own death to escape debt. A completely bankrupt German count staged a massive fake funeral just to avoid paying bills. Count von Manderscheid accumulated absolute massive financial debts, paying for incredibly fancy parties and clothes. Instead of facing angry wealthy bankers, he locked himself inside his dark, quiet stone bedroom. His loyal weeping servants publicly announced that the poor count died from a sudden illness. They completely filled a heavy wooden coffin with rocks and held a massive, sad funeral. While creditors watched the fake burial, the very alive count sneaked completely out the back door. He safely escaped to a completely different foreign country and started a brand new life. Historians only discovered his absolutely brilliant scam by finding his letters written many years later. Faking your own death is the absolute ultimate historical loophole for escaping terrible credit scores. 31. The executioner who became a respected celebrity. A professional medieval killer actually became one of the most beloved famous doctors in Germany. Franz Schmidt worked as the official state executioner for the city of Nuremberg for decades. Because he constantly studied human anatomy during torture, he actually understood basic human bodily functions. Citizens started visiting this terrifying killer asking for medical help with their totally normal injuries. He successfully healed thousands of sick people and became a highly respected, wealthy medical professional. The local emperor eventually granted him official noble status and legally restored his family honor. This man spent his mornings legally chopping off heads and his afternoons completely curing illnesses. The absolute weirdest career pivot in history completely saved a notorious and bloody family legacy. 32. The imperial law dictating the exact width of lace on a collar. The imperial government completely wasted time creating strict, massive laws about extremely minor clothing details. During the 16th century, wealthy merchants started wearing incredibly fancy clothes, normally reserved for nobility. Furious German princes passed sumptuary laws to legally control exactly what commoners could physically wear. These incredibly ridiculous rules legally dictated the maximum allowable width of white lace on shirts. Peasant women faced heavy fines if they wore the completely wrong shade of red fabric. Town guards literally carried wooden measuring sticks to check the length of a civilian jacket. Citizens constantly completely ignored these stupid rules and bought black market velvet ribbons anyway happily. The local authorities wasted massive amounts of time trying to police everyday basic civilian fashion choices. When the government tries to legally control your closet, the entire political system is breaking. 33. The fortress captured using a disguise of nuns. Clever enemy soldiers completely bypassed a massive, heavily guarded castle gate by wearing religious dresses. During a bitter, violent regional war, capturing a high mountain fortress seemed practically completely impossible. The attacking commander purchased dozens of long, flowing, dark black habits worn by Catholic nuns. A group of heavily armed, bearded men completely hid their sharp swords under these robes. They slowly walked up to the heavy castle gates, pretending to be completely lost sisters. The extremely foolish local guards immediately opened the massive wooden doors to help the women. The fake nuns suddenly dropped their dark robes and completely slaughtered the surprised enemy guards. They successfully captured an absolutely impregnable massive stone fortress without firing a single heavy cannon. Trusting strangers in a war zone is terrible even if they wear very holy outfits.